The first thing I saw was a strip of raw dirt running straight across my front yard, and for a second I honestly thought somebody had crashed a piece of heavy equipment through my property by mistake. Then my headlights caught the orange warning tape fluttering in the evening breeze, fresh piles of soil stacked shoulder high, and a bright plastic conduit disappearing into a trench that cut my lawn clean in half like somebody had drawn a knife through it. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident at all. Somebody had planned this, paid for this, and somehow decided they didn't need my permission. My name is Daniel Mercer, and until that week, I thought I had a pretty good understanding of what living next to an HOA meant. I expected annoying newsletters, arguments about mailbox colors, maybe the occasional complaint about weeds growing too high after a rainy weekend. I never imagined I'd come home from visiting my sister in Knoxville to find construction crews treating my property like it belonged to someone else. I'd owned that little farmhouse just outside Millstone Ridge for almost 18 years, long before the subdivision behind me ever existed. That land had belonged to my grandfather, who planted every oak tree lining the driveway with his own hands. My wife Emily and I raised our daughter there, buried 2 old dogs under the maple tree by the fence, celebrated birthdays on that porch, watched thunderstorms roll across those fields every spring. To most people, it looked like an ordinary yard. To me, it was a family scrapbook written in dirt and grass, standing there with the truck still idling behind me. I noticed my sprinkler heads twisted sideways, one completely ripped out of the ground, while the roots of a young oak we'd planted after Emily beat cancer were sticking out of the trench like exposed veins. That hurt a whole lot more than the ruined grass. I barely slept that night. Every time I looked out the bedroom window, I could see the flashing amber light on an excavator parked halfway across my property, as if it had every right to spend the night there. Around sunrise, I walked outside carrying a mug of coffee and found a man wearing a reflective vest, studying a clipboard while pacing along the trench. He looked up, smiled politely, and said, "Morning, sir. Try not to step too close to the excavation." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. "Excuse me." He pointed toward the conduit. "Fiber installation. We're connecting utilities for Phase 3 of the Cedar Brook expansion." I stared at him for a few seconds before asking the only question that mattered. "Why are you standing in my yard?" He didn't hesitate. "The HOA president told us this section is covered by a community utility easement." He said it so casually that for one strange moment I wondered if I'd somehow forgotten signing something years ago. Then common sense kicked in. I'd read every page of my deed when we refinanced the house. There wasn't any easement crossing my backyard. Never had been. "You're mistaken," I told him. "This is private property." He shrugged the way people do when they know they'll be gone before anyone gets angry at them. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA. We're just following instructions." Well, I did exactly that. About 20 minutes later, I parked outside the Cedar Brook clubhouse, walked through the front doors, and found the HOA president sitting behind a polished wooden desk answering emails like she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a suburban neighborhood association. Her name was Lorraine Baxter, a retired real estate broker who always dressed like she expected photographers to appear at any moment. Perfect hair, oversized sunglasses sitting on top of her head even indoors, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She looked up, recognized me immediately, and somehow managed to smile wider. "Mr. Mercer, what can I do for you?" I placed a handful of photographs on her desk, pictures I'd taken of the trench 10 minutes earlier. "Your contractors dug across my property." She barely glanced at the photos. "Yes, they're installing infrastructure for the expansion." "On my land." "Community easement." She said those 2 words like they ended every conversation. "I'd like to see the recorded easement." She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands together, and gave me the same patient smile adults sometimes give toddlers who ask impossible questions. "We don't have to provide those documents to you." I blinked. "Actually, I think you do." "No, Mr. Mercer," she replied, her voice almost sweet enough to hide the arrogance underneath. "What you need to understand is that this project benefits everyone. Faster internet, higher property values, improved infrastructure. You should really be thanking us." I could feel my heartbeat climbing, but years of working as a mechanic had taught me something valuable. When somebody wants you angry, staying calm usually scares them a lot more. So instead of arguing, I simply asked one last question. "Are you absolutely certain there's a legal easement across my property?" Without the slightest hesitation, she nodded. "Positive. And if you interfere with construction, the association will consider legal action for delaying community improvements." I thanked her, picked up my photographs, and walked out without another word. She probably thought she'd won. The funny thing about confidence is that it looks exactly the same whether it's backed by facts or by a lie that's about to collapse. When I got home, I unlocked the old fireproof safe my grandfather bought sometime in the 70s, pulled out the original property deed, along with every survey I'd ever saved, spread them across the kitchen table, and as the afternoon sunlight poured through the window, I started tracing every boundary line with my finger. And less than 5 minutes later, I found the first crack in Lorraine Baxter's perfect little story. The more I studied those documents, the quieter I became, because nothing about Lorraine Baxter's story lined up with the paperwork sitting on my kitchen table. Every survey, every tax map, every closing document I'd signed over nearly 2 decades showed the exact same thing. My property line ran uninterrupted from the old split-rail fence all the way to the creek, and nowhere, not in the margins, not in the notes, not hidden in some forgotten amendment, was there any mention of a utility easement. I checked twice, then a third time, mostly because I wanted to prove myself wrong before accusing someone of something this serious. Emily walked into the kitchen carrying 2 sandwiches, looked at the stack of papers, then at my face, and quietly asked, "They're lying, aren't they?" I didn't answer right away. I simply slid one of the surveys toward her and pointed to the boundary. She didn't know much about property law, but she knew enough to recognize when a straight line was supposed to stay straight. "So what now?" she asked. I folded the papers carefully, put them back into their sleeves, and said, "Now we stop guessing." The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office, a brick building that looked like it hadn't changed since the early 70s. The clerk behind the counter was an older gentleman named Harold who had probably seen every property dispute in the county at least twice. I explained the situation without adding any drama. He disappeared into the records room for nearly 20 minutes before returning with a thick binder and several digital maps pulled up on his computer. We compared my deed to the county records, parcel by parcel, line by line, and eventually he leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and frowned. "Mr. Mercer," he said slowly, "unless something happened that somehow escaped every department in this county, there is no recorded easement crossing your property." I asked him to check again. He did, same answer. Then he looked at me with that expression government employees get when they realize somebody else has created a much bigger problem than the one sitting in front of them. "Who exactly is digging?" he asked. "Contractors hired by the Cedarbrook HOA. Harold let out a low whistle. "Well, somebody's about to have a very uncomfortable week." That should have been enough, but something kept bothering me. If they were willing to invent an easement, what else had they skipped? So instead of driving home, I called the utility locating company and hired a technician named Marcus to scan the trench before any more work disappeared underground. Marcus showed up the following afternoon with enough equipment to look like he was preparing to launch a satellite. He spent almost an hour walking slowly across my yard while strange electronic tones chirped from his receiver. Finally, he stopped near the middle of the trench, looked at the conduit, and scratched his beard. "This is odd." I asked what he meant. "There's no permit marker." I had no idea what that meant. He explained that projects like this almost always leave a paper trail. Permits, utility notifications, inspection numbers, locator requests. Contractors hate surprises because surprises cost money. He checked again using another device, then shook his head. "If this was done legally, I'm not seeing the documentation I'd expect." That single sentence changed everything. At that point, I wasn't just dealing with a pushy HOA president anymore. I might be looking at unauthorized excavation on private land. I called my attorney, Richard Collins, a man whose greatest talent wasn't courtroom speeches but asking simple questions that made other people nervous. After listening to everything, he said exactly 4 words: "Don't touch anything yet." By evening, he had drafted an emergency request asking the county development office to halt all work until ownership, permits, and easement rights could be verified. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was simply a request for government inspectors to confirm whether the project was legal before anyone buried the evidence. Richard smiled as he faxed the paperwork and said, "If they're right, construction resumes tomorrow. If they're wrong, they'll wish they'd asked permission." I slept better that night than I had since finding the trench. Not because I expected victory, but because facts were finally replacing assumptions. Around 6:30 the following morning, I heard diesel engines outside again. I looked through the front window and saw the contractor's crew arriving with fresh gravel and compacting equipment. Apparently nobody had warned them. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch just as two county pickup trucks rolled into my driveway. A sheriff's deputy followed behind them. 3 inspectors climbed out carrying clipboards and measuring wheels, while the construction crew stood around looking increasingly confused. One of the inspectors introduced himself, asked whether I was Daniel Mercer, then requested permission to enter my property. I almost laughed at the irony. "You're the first people who've asked all week." He smiled politely before walking straight to the trench. The site supervisor hurried over, already reaching for his paperwork. But within minutes, the conversation took a turn I could hear even from my porch. "Can you provide the excavation permit?" the inspector asked. The supervisor shuffled through his folder. "Our office handles permits. Do you have a copy?" "Not with me." "Recorded easement? The developer told us it existed. Can you show it?" Silence. The inspector made several notes, then motioned toward another official, who began photographing everything from multiple angles. 10 minutes later, bright yellow stopwork notices were being taped to equipment while the deputy quietly stood nearby, making sure nobody decided to ignore them. Workers climbed out of the trench, removed their hard hats, and started making phone calls. You could almost feel the mood changing by the minute. Half an hour later, the familiar whine of an electric golf cart echoed down the road. Lorraine Baxter arrived, moving much faster than those little carts were ever designed to travel. She jumped out before it had completely stopped and marched directly toward the inspectors. "What is going on?" she demanded. Nobody answered immediately. One inspector simply handed her the preliminary notice. I watched from my porch as she scanned the page, then looked up with visible disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're delaying an approved community project." The inspector remained perfectly calm. "Ma'am, we're attempting to locate the recorded easement authorizing excavation across this parcel." She pointed directly at me. "He's causing trouble because he doesn't like the association." I finally walked down to the fence line, not to argue, just to hear the conversation more clearly. Lorraine saw me and raised her voice another octave. "Are you happy now? You've delayed internet service for hundreds of families." I shrugged. "I asked to see the easement 3 days ago. You don't need to see everything." Apparently, somebody does. One of the inspectors looked up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, we've contacted the county recorder's office. At this time, we have found no recorded utility easement affecting this property." For the first time since I'd met Lorraine Baxter, she had absolutely nothing to say. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The confidence she'd worn like expensive jewelry all week disappeared almost instantly. She pulled out her phone and began calling someone, probably the developer. Maybe an attorney. Maybe anyone who could explain why the county's records didn't match the promises she'd been making. Over the next several days, the investigation spread far beyond my front yard. County engineers reviewed subdivision plans. Environmental inspectors examined the excavation because the trench ran dangerously close to a drainage channel feeding the creek behind my property. Utility companies were asked whether they had authorized installation. They hadn't. The developer insisted the HOA had assured everyone the legal paperwork was complete. The HOA board quietly claimed they'd relied on information provided by consultants. Contractors said they'd simply followed signed work orders. Suddenly, nobody wanted ownership of the decision that only a week earlier, everyone had defended so confidently. Richard called me every evening with updates, and each phone call revealed another loose thread. One missing permit became 2. One paperwork discrepancy uncovered another. What had started as a trench across one man's yard was beginning to expose a chain of assumptions, shortcuts, and people signing documents they apparently never bothered to verify. Then, almost a week after the inspectors first arrived, the county issued the order nobody in Cedar Brook expected. Every inch of conduit crossing my property had to be removed immediately, and until the investigation concluded, the entire expansion project would remain suspended. Watching them undo their own work was strangely quiet, not because the machines were silent, but because all the shouting had finally stopped. The same excavators that had carved through my lawn without a second thought were now moving inch by inch under the watchful eyes of county inspectors, carefully lifting every section of orange conduit back out of the ground like surgeons trying to reverse a bad operation. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody told me I should be grateful for faster internet. Nobody talked about community improvements. They simply worked, because now every scoop of dirt, every broken sprinkler head, every damaged root system had become evidence attached to a file with the county seal on it. A landscaping company arrived 2 days later with pallets of fresh sod, replacement irrigation parts, and 3 young oak trees after an arborist concluded the original tree had suffered too much root damage to survive. The foreman walked over holding his clipboard and quietly asked, "Where would you like the new one planted?" It was probably the first time anyone connected to that project had asked my opinion about anything. I smiled and pointed a few feet away from the old location. "Right there. And this time, let's keep it on my side of the property." He chuckled, nodded, and got back to work. Word spread through town faster than I ever expected. At the diner, people would stop me just to ask if the stories were true. Some had heard the HOA was being sued. Others claimed the developer had fired half the project managers. One man insisted federal investigators were coming, which wasn't true. But that's small-town life. Facts travel slowly while rumors drive sports cars. The truth was dramatic enough without any exaggeration. The county required the HOA to pay for restoring my yard, repairing every damaged irrigation line, replacing the landscaping, and covering my legal expenses related to the trespass investigation. More importantly, the expansion project remained frozen while engineers and attorneys sorted through months of paperwork that should have been verified before the first shovel ever touched the ground. Delays turned into penalties, penalties turned into expensive contract disputes, and what had once been advertised as a smooth new phase for Cedar Brook became a financial headache that nobody wanted to claim responsibility for. As for Lorraine Baxter, I saw her exactly one more time, a few weeks after everything settled down. I was loading mulch into the back of my truck at the local garden center when she happened to walk past pushing a shopping cart filled with flowers. She noticed me, hesitated for a second, then slowly walked over. There wasn't any anger left in her face, just exhaustion. "Mr. Mercer," she began, "I suppose things got a little more complicated than any of us expected." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "No, Lorraine, they were always complicated. You just decided not to check." She lowered her eyes. "Nobody intended to hurt you." I believed her. I really did. Most disasters don't begin with evil intentions. They begin with shortcuts, assumptions, and people convincing themselves they'll deal with the details later. "Intentions matter," I told her, "but they don't erase consequences." She nodded once, quietly wished me a good afternoon, and walked away. That was the last conversation we ever had. Sometimes people ask me if I feel like I got revenge. Honestly, I don't think revenge is the right word. Revenge would have been sneaking onto their property and digging up their landscaping in the middle of the night. Revenge would have been trying to embarrass them in front of the whole town. I never wanted any of that. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the same respect they expected from me. I wanted someone to knock on my front door before treating my family's land like an empty line on a blueprint. I wanted the truth instead of confidence wrapped in expensive words. In the end, I didn't shut down their expansion with anger, threats, or some clever trick. I shut it down with paperwork, patience, and one stubborn refusal to let somebody else's authority replace actual facts. Every time I mow that lawn now, I pass the young oak tree growing where the old one once stood, and I think about my grandfather. He used to tell me that land has a long memory. It remembers every footprint, every promise, every person who cared enough to protect it. Back then, I thought he was just being poetic. Now I understand exactly what he meant. So here's the question I want to leave with you. If your neighbor, your HOA, or even a developer showed up one morning claiming they had the right to use your property, would you trust their word, or would you ask to see the paperwork first? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments. Was Lorraine simply overconfident and trying to move a project along? Or did the HOA knowingly gamble with someone else's property because they assumed no one would challenge them? Have you ever dealt with an HOA or local authority that crossed the line? I'd really like to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes standing your ground doesn't always require raising your voice. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is quietly insist that the truth be proven.